New Explorer Corps, First Arm, Spinward Operations Area, System, The Last Resort, Zenith Jump Point, Jump Ship, Rabbit's Foot, November 11th, 3152. Corporal Miri Kirsch was leaning over the console looking at some of the data coming in off one of the frozen outlier planets in the system when the jump signature alarm began to go off. Her screen quickly flickered over to the view of the Last Resort's jump ship, which flickered out of existence. Crap, she muttered to herself as she quickly triggered the Rabbit's Foot's general alarm. Rin ran through the bridge door a few minutes later. Still putting on her uniform shirt, Rin yelped out, "How long ago did they jump?" Miri did the math in her head before responding. 13 minutes and change. If they've hot-charged their jump drives for a return trip, they could be back at any moment. It's safe to assume they have. Notify Captain Tanabe that we're about to contest this jump point, Rin said with determination. She pulled up her comlink with Washi and Noel, the latter of which was already on patrol. Ravens, I hope you're ready. We're about to have a fight on our hands. Expect comms to go down, so follow the lead of the Combined Forces. Aft Captain. Washi's voice came first, followed quickly by Noel's. Aft Captain. Captain, Miri said. The Kikumaru's dropships are deploying their aerofighters and increasing their distance from the jump ship. Captain Tanabe has requested that we get the Rabbit's Foot moving so we aren't a stationary target. Rin nodded and responded. Well, let's hope those thrusters still work. It's been a while since the Rabbit's Foot has sailed anywhere. Planet, The Last Resort 4, King's Compound. Whatever was planned, they weren't ready for Olivia. Unleashing her righteous fury, the Thunderbolt took a wide stance and fired its medium lasers, machine guns, and SRMs into the ramparts around the defensive perimeter. The Last Resort's mech bay didn't open so much as it exploded with the rushing Mortis. The Combined Panther, which had not yet reacted to the situation, slowly turned toward the oncoming black battlemech, but it was bowled over like it wasn't even there. Gunfire erupted from all corners of the compound as Olivia's Thunderbolt stalked and the battle-armored DCMS soldiers started to march toward the King's residence in a well-trained but chaotic wave. The heavy machine guns from the Kishis raked the ramparts and poured fire into the nearest buildings. Meanwhile, the Oni suits stomped forward, attacking anyone holding a weapon. Olivia tried to track targets, but soldiers seemed to be streaming out of every building, nook and cranny. Her Thunderbolt was being hit, but almost everything was just superficial. She turned her mech, screaming, into her cockpit. Olivia had finally reached her breaking point with this. She squeezed the trigger and fired the particle projection cannon into a corner turret, which evaporated a couple of troopers who were trying to line up a shot with a short-range missile launcher. When she turned enough to see the Mortis, Olivia was completely blinded by her rage. There in front of her was the mech piloted by the man most responsible for May's death. As the Mortis hacked down on the prone DCMS Panther, Olivia pushed her Thunderbolt into a run across the open courtyard. Missiles began to streak across the base as the attackers finally got their sights set up, but Olivia didn't care. At nearly a full run, she dropped the Thunderbolt's shoulder and smashed her mech into the Mortis, knocking both mechs off their feet and sending them sprawling through the outer wall of the compound. Slammed against the belts of her command chair, Olivia screamed again, pulling back the Thunderbolt's left arm and smashing the mech's fist into the Mortis, as it twisted and brought the hatchet around to hack at her mech's leg. Two heavy mechs hammered at each other over and over again, though the hatchet really couldn't find purchase with the Thunderbolt on top of it. SRM streaked out from the walls and impacted Olivia's back armor, but she would not be distracted. "You killed her! You killed her!" she screamed through sore and cracked lips as tears ran down her face. The swinging hatchet began to slow, then the arm went completely limp. Punching repeatedly, finally the Thunderbolt's ruined hand caught inside the remains of the Mortis's cockpit and upper torso, and then tore away completely. Only then did Olivia stop. Her heavy breathing, along with the proximity alarms from the occasional SRM launch, were Olivia's only companions in those few seconds after her hollow victory. Planet, The Last Resort 4, King's Compound. Cal cursed himself for not bringing a sidearm. Hiding beneath the banquet table, a terrible silence fell across the room for several seconds before the first gunshots rang out. Cal snuck a peek to see the guards in orange walking from person to person in the room and putting several rounds into each. No one was spared, DCMS or the Last Resort Elite. Closing his eyes, Cal tried to sort out a plan. Maybe he could grab a guard and wrestle away a rifle before being cut down. Maybe he could hide under the table until they all leave. Maybe they wouldn't look for him. Gia's seductive saccharine voice interrupted his brainstorming as she walked back into the hall. Oh no, what a terrible turn of events. Those dastardly snakes from the Draconis Combine have attacked our king and court. Oh, how ever will we go on? Her sarcasm was so obvious that Cal had to admire it for what it was, distilled, scheming malice. The clicking of her heeled boots on the marble tile continued across the room till reaching the body of the king. She dropped to one knee to lean in close to him, and Cal could no longer see from his position, so he went back to trying to sort out a plan. Once again, he was interrupted, but this time it was from the garish stained glass window along the outer wall, shattering and raining glass down across the hall. The sounds of distant gunfire from the compound flowed into the hall just before Vasil's white and blue elemental armor rocketed in on plumes of plasma. When his armor hit the marble tiles, they shattered underneath. Several of the guards lifted their rifles and fired at the elemental, which sent ricochets around the room. At that point, Cal risked another peek from under the tablecloth and was witness to the unchained ferocity of a clan warrior. The elemental seemed to move with grace far beyond the technology's capabilities as it ran and leapt over tables. The micropulse laser cut into enemies at a distance, while the battlecloth snapped bones and tore limbs as if they were wet paper. If he wasn't so absolutely terrified by this display of violence, Cal would have been impressed. Gia pulled the pins on a couple of grenades and tossed them over the head table before crawling for the exit. The resulting flash and spray of shrapnel cut through fabric, soldiers, and left a charred mark on Vasil's leg armor. He was about to follow Gia when he heard Cal's anguished groan. Turning to the source of it, he kneeled down and lifted the table, revealing Cal cradling a bleeding arm. Time to go, Vasil said as he pushed the table over the rest of the way. Cal laughed through the pain and yelped out, "And Miss Dessert?" "Olivia is fighting in the courtyard with the others. We need to get to the spaceport," Vasil said as he placed himself between Cal and the doorway Gia had run through. Scanning the room, no one else was moving. Small fires now burned around the ruined Great Hall. Cal stumbled to his feet, then grabbed the rifle from a detached arm and said, "We need to get her. She might be our ticket out of the system." "I will do that. You find a vehicle and get back," Vasil said, already running towards Gia's exit. Planet The Last Resort 4, LR Spaceport. For the past 20 minutes, Tenica and Max had watched with great interest the milling about of the spaceport personnel. Soldiers in orange cambo mixed with the black fatigues of security officers, and they didn't seem to be really going anywhere. A few hovercraft roamed the perimeter, and there was more and more movement in the streets. The DCMS soldiers held their perimeter, waving off the occasional spaceport employee who wandered too close. "Max, what do you make of this?" Tenica asked as she shifted a bit in her King Crab's command couch. The axeman turned slightly and slowly raised its massive hatcheted arm as Max responded, "Looks like they're trying to look busy, like being a distraction." Tenica sighed before saying, "That's what I was thinking." Just as she clicked open the comlink with Cal, it, along with the mech's sensors, went dark. The milling dots in her HUD faded out and things got quiet. "Cal? Max? Olivia? Can you hear me? Vasil?" Tenica asked into the comlink. Whatever was happening was impacting everyone as Max's axeman turned to look back at her as she stood at the base of the dropship ramp. The Combine soldiers were looking around, making hand gestures that suggested they weren't communicating either. Suddenly, Tenica realized the last resort had triggered whatever system they had that could lock people out of sensors and communication. "Shit," she said as she made sure all of her weapons were online and the mech's 2 heavy PPC capacitors were charging. Lacking any other way to communicate, she aimed her torso up a bit and fired her 2 medium lasers up into the sky above the heads of the Combine. Some turned as she deliberately stomped the King Crab's feet in place. Just a few moments later, the LRMs started to impact in amongst the battle-armored soldiers. High explosive rounds rained down while hovercraft slid out of hangars and into the spaceport grounds from surrounding streets. Security officers waved them in after opening the gates, before grabbing their rifles and heading toward the dropships. Several PPC shots streaked into the side of the Leopard from the Shrek PPC carrier which rolled onto the grounds. Even though it was pointless, Tenica yelped into the comms, calling out targets out of habit. She lined up her left arm and fired her heavy PPC, which impacted the Shrek's front armor and cored it in like the armor was non-existent. The tank collapsed in on itself as the PPC capacitors popped and added to the tank's death throes. Max's axeman stomped forward like a hunter seeking prey. When a hovercraft strayed too close, he fired his LB-20X autocannon, and what had been a vehicle suddenly became a streaking stain of burning machine parts on the ferrocrete. The DCMS catapult stalked, firing its PPCs at targets as they came into view, but it could do little against the swarming infantry units firing SRMs from cover. To their credit, the Combine soldiers leapt into action, quickly moving into the advancing infantry formations and causing chaos. They were seemingly fearless, and Tenica could respect that, even though now it made it difficult for her to get a clean shot on targets. The Combine Panther began to run, using its speed to avoid incoming fire, but the surroundings were cramped, and whenever it had to turn and run in the opposite direction, it took fire. Being unable to coordinate their fire, the defense of the dropships was haphazard and infuriating. Tenica gripped her command sticks and stomped the king crab forward a few steps, raking the nearby hangars with fire in hope of hitting last resort reinforcements still inside, and to possibly notify Cal and the others that things were going down at the spaceport. In the distance, through smoke and the light show in front of her, Tenica could see the stalking forms of battlemechs. The orange enforcer peeked out from behind a building and fired a solid round from its LB-10X, which impacted on the king crab's tough torso armor. Tenica growled and fired back with a heavy PPC shot, but it impacted the building rather than the mech behind it. Glass and steel melted, and the whole corner of the structure started to slump and then collapse. But by that point, the enforcer had moved on. It felt like a hopeless situation as more long-range missiles streamed down on their position. The Eulalia was taking fire, but thankfully nothing too serious yet. Her and Max's ECMs were having a deleterious effect on the nearby missiles, which were impacting in amongst their own units as often as against the dropships and battlemechs. Unfortunately, Tenica felt as if she had no control over the situation and seemingly no way to change it. Another hit from the autocannon tore up her left thigh armor as she slowly turned to face it. For the first time since finding the king crab, Tenica wished she was in her Zeus again. She simply couldn't face down an enemy that surrounded them. Max's axeman continued to lash out, even as it started to take more and more significant damage from the unending stream of infantry-launched short-range missiles. Tenica could tell that he was getting frustrated as he stomped his mech into the fray, stomping on attackers and swinging the mech's hatchet. Some poor souls were hit by the massive melee weapon, and their bodies were tossed across the ferrocrete. In the distance, the catapult's Mechwarrior had resorted to firing into the masses of soldiers and hovercraft, including the Oni and Kishi battle armor. While the PPC shots did kill dozens of attackers with each hit, there were also the occasional friendly fire incidents. As ferocious as the Onis were, the numerical advantage of the attackers was gradually winning out. More and more of the battle-suited infantry were falling and not getting back up, even as the ferrocrete around the dropships was littered with the dead and dying. "We need to get out of here," Tenica said as she pushed the king crab into a walk. Turning again, she lifted her mech's right arm to point at the sky and fired the PPC directly up, hoping that the Eulalia's pilot would understand that they should lift off. Stomping forward, she raked the attackers in front of the mech with laser and autocannon fire, making a hole for the mech to move through. She hoped that Max would follow her lead as she moved closer to the edge of the spaceport. The action caught the elusive enforcer off guard as it nearly ran into the king crab as she kicked down the fencing and moved the mech onto the main thoroughfare. The medium mech slid, then tried to rapidly back up, but Tenica wasn't going to miss this opportunity. She grinned wickedly as she raised the king crab's arms and fired both heavy PPCs along with a pair of medium lasers. Heat washed over the laughing Mechwarrior as she watched the orange enforcer buckle under the near alpha strike. The blue lightning ripped into the medium mech's torso, dancing into the internal structure and rendering its bones into melted scrap. Mid-fall, the Mechwarrior ejected, and the remains of the mech hit the street with a satisfying crash. Continuing her march down the street around the perimeter of the spaceport, Tenica could see the firing positions being set up along with two other battlemechs. A Jenner trotted in the distance, and beyond that a Calliope was firing its plasma rifle toward the spaceport. Tenica's heart sank when she realized that Calliope was most likely piloted by Akif, her former friend in the NEC. Suddenly her comlink crackled to life with a dozen different voices. Some were shouting orders, some were desperately asking for help, at least one was just screaming. Tenica lined up a shot on the Jenner, but it must have seen her as it zipped behind a building. "Max, are you getting this? Comms are back, I think," Tenica said as she keyed into just the NEC channel. "I'm here, just hurting pretty bad. I think we need to go," Max responded with a very tired and strained voice. Tenica sprayed the street ahead of her with autocannon fire, catching a few groups of clumped soldiers as the sight of her mech caused many others to run in terror. The Calliope turned to face her mech, and Tenica was bracing for the incoming plasma round, but it didn't come. The mech hesitated and then turned and fled behind an apartment building. "Cal, are you able to hear us? Olivia?" Tenica asked as she fired into a truck with jerry-rigged SRM packs on the back. There was a brief delay, then Olivia's voice came over the comlink. She sounded tired but angry, which Tenica could sympathize with at the moment. Olivia said, "We're on our way back. Keep an eye out for a limo. Cal is inside. Vasil should be nearby. Hold the line. We will be there soon." "Okay, but are you okay?" Tenica asked. If Olivia answered, Tenica didn't hear it as the king crab shuddered and then smashed into the building on its right. Slammed against the side of the command chair, Tenica saw stars as the mech stumbled into the now collapsing building. Her view screen showed a flash of movement and then nothing at all. "Tenica, get back to the dropships. We can't support you out there," Max spoke into the comms as he fired his lasers at the Last Resort's Jenner. When he didn't get a response, he furrowed his brow and stalked forward toward where she had been a minute before. From the plume of rising smoke and ferrocrete dust, a gigantic mech stalked forward. Max's eyes went wide as he realized it was the 100-ton Berserker. Painted bright orange, the assault battlemech was such a distraction that soldiers stopped fighting to look up at it as it stomped onto the starport ferrocrete. At this point, with communications returned, the battle armor began to retreat back toward the Combine's Condor troop transport. The Leopard MC was already preparing to take off, with its ramps closing after the catapult and Panther retreated inside. Max looked at the map and saw things were not looking good. The DCMS soldiers were bugging out and leaving the NEC behind. The dropships were still firing on the attacking units, but it was just barely keeping them back. "Dang it, where are you, Tenica?" he yelled into the comlink as he lined up his first shot on the Berserker. End Part 10. That's it for this week, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, let the YouTube algorithm know by hitting all the buttons. You know how this works. Big thank you to those who are sticking with the story. It's been such a blast to keep it going as long as we have. We'll find out soon how all this turns out. Remember that becoming a channel member is a great way to support the creation of new BattleTech content, both with original fiction and the always fun lore stuff. The nonsense must flow. Until we meet again, take care and go make the world a slightly better place today and tomorrow.